My name is Stephanie Toole. I'm Education and Outreach Manager here at the Madeline Museum. So thank you so much for joining us for this History Happy Hour presentation of Circe in Greek history with Dr. Niall W. Slater, who I'll introduce a little bit on from now as we watched our History Happy Hour cocktail tutorial video. The Big Read this year focuses on Circe by Madeline Miller. NEA Big Read is a program of the National Endowment for the Arts in partnership with Arts Midwest. This year, we are pleased to partner with the Massillon Public Library and a host of other partners throughout Massillon and Western Stark County to offer 40 programs in conjunction with this year's book selection. If you'd like to learn more about our books, book programs, you can find that information at massillonmuseum.org/bigread. So everyone knows if we have any tech issues or anything, you can enter those into the chat or the question and answer. Brandon Rohr, my colleague who's our guest operations manager and resident tech wizard, is here with us tonight, so he'll be able to help us with that. And we will have time for questions for Dr. Slater at the end of the presentation, so please feel free throughout the presentation to enter those into the chat and the question and answer box. You are not visible as an attendee, and we cannot hear you, so you know. It's just the panelists here, so me, Brandon, and Niall are the ones who are visible on the screen. And now before we get started with Dr. Slater's presentation, I will share the tutorial for Joshua Kuhn's original Circe-inspired cocktail, which is called Circe's Island Potion.
Hello, my name is Joshua Kuhn. I am husband of Alexander Nicholas Kuhn, the executive director at MassMU. And tonight I'm going to be making a cocktail which is going to be based on gin and a smoky scotch. If you don't have this version of Famous Grouse, which is fairly new to me, any blended scotch will do. If you have a single malt, especially from the Isla region, that would be even tastier. Those are quite expensive. This will run you about 22, 24 bucks, in that range. And the old standby, Gordon's London Dry. I like it for martinis. I like it for mixing. There are better gins. There are more exciting gins, but you can't go wrong with Gordon's. So again, if you have something like a Hendrick's or a higher end gin that you want to use, feel free. The more floral notes, the better. I just like my gin dry. In addition to that, you'll see in the instructions that we are using today a rosemary simple syrup. Now, don't be afraid. It's really not that complicated to make this. Simple syrup is simply equal parts water and sugar. You can use a cup of each, you can use 2 cups of each. It depends on how much you like sugar in your life. The only difference is, once you get the sugar and the water mixed together in a saucepan on heat, as the sugar dissolves while you stir it, you're going to add roughly 4 sprigs of rosemary to the pan. Turn the heat off or all the way down. Cover it, let it steep for like 15-20 minutes, just like you're making some kind of tea or anything of that sort, and then let it cool. So if you're making this cocktail and you don't have the syrup already made, I would suggest you make this about an hour ahead of time. That way you give it time to cool down and you're not pouring hot liquid into your cocktail, which is never a good thing, unless you're making a hot toddy. So assuming you've made the syrup, I've also gone ahead and squeezed half of a lemon. You're going to need roughly a ½ ounce, and that's typically most lemons will yield about a ½ ounce per half. I'm also chilling a cocktail glass with ice. Usually I would do this in the freezer, but because of production concerns, we're doing it this way. Crushed ice works the best. That's what they use in really good bars. So I'm going to transfer this ice now back to my little ice bowl so it doesn't get any more watery than it is. So assuming your glass is chilled, The first thing we're going to do, this is the exciting and also optional part of the cocktail. This is what is going to give it the extra rosemary and smoky flavor. So I have a wooden cutting board. You can use anything that's not going to catch on fire. And on top of it, I've placed basically a little plate of foil. There are fancier ways to do this, but I figure everyone has foil in the house. Probably everyone has one of these. So if you have a rocks glass handy or a glass jar, basically anything that's roughly this shape. The nice thing about the rocks glass is that if you're going to serve the cocktail in the glass, you can just go directly in, and I'll show you. So what we're going to do is get some flame on this rosemary. The drier the rosemary is, the easier it is to smoke. So if you have really, really fresh rosemary, try if you can to leave it out in the sun or just age it for a while. This is semi-dry, but it's not sparking quite as much as I want it to. But you'll get the idea. Now you can buy fancy tools to help you smoke these herbs and other, even cherry wood, apple wood, for cocktails at home and other uses, but again, everyone has these things on hand. So once you see some smoke rising, you're going to cover the rosemary with your rocks glass. And you can, I don't know if you can see it on the camera, but it is collecting smoke, so that's a good thing. So one reason why I am smoking the herbs is because in the book, Circe, as she's walking through the woods, discovering all these new things and learning how to become essentially a witch, she talks about all the different ways that she deals with herbs, whether it be boiling them, smoking them, lighting them on fire, all kinds of different things. So that's what gave me this idea to add a little bit of smokiness to the rosemary syrup. So you're going to get rosemary with the sugar, which will enhance that aspect of the cocktail, but you're also going to get this sort of unusual mouthfeel from the smoke, hopefully, assuming we do everything correctly. So now we're going to take our cocktail glass. This could be a pint glass, basically anything that's roughly that big. You're going to take your gin. This is going to be about 1 ounce of gin, or we'll call it 1 part gin, because you may want to make something a little bigger. Don't spill it like I did. I usually free pour. I'm not a professional bartender. I tend not to use a jigger, but for the purpose of the video, I'm trying to be a little more professional. And in goes your scotch. We're going to use a 1/2 ounce of scotch, or a 1/2 part to our 1 part gin. So in goes the scotch. As I said before, I already squeezed 1/2 a lemon. I've measured it out again. This is going to be a 1/2 part, so equal to the scotch. And now for our rosemary syrup, we want a 1/2 ounce of that. Now, if you're someone who likes sweeter cocktails, you may end up adding a little more after you taste it, which we will do after we stir in the ice. Now notice I'm not shaking it. This is a high-end cocktail and we're using gin, so we're not shaking it. If you were making a margarita for a bunch of your friends who typically drink Coors Light, sure, feel free to shake, but this is not one of those kind of drinks. So I mentioned the instructions, stir for about, you want to stir about 75 times vigorously. I've done this many times, so I'm just going to feel the glass. As the glass starts to frost and get cool, I'll know that I'm close. Okay, that should be pretty close. Now I have a straw handy. I'm going to taste this for balance. What I'm looking for is the tartness versus the sweetness. That's about how I'd want it, but I know Alex likes her drinks a little sweeter. So I'm going to add little more of the rosemary syrup. Give that a quick stir. Now we have our smoke-filled rocks glass, and we're going to get our strainer. And what we're going to do is trap the smoke using the liquid. So as the liquid goes in, the smoke will be trapped in that liquid. At least that's what chemistry is supposed to tell us. Now, if you were serving this as is, I would suggest using a bourbon cube. So you want a big ice cube that's not going to melt immediately and dilute your cocktail. If you don't have one of these handy, I would suggest serving it in the cocktail glass. So I'll show you both versions. Here's the rocks version, and you can just float that strawberry right there. If you can get it to stay. And then if you're serving it in the cocktail glass, we're going to go like this. Now, obviously, you won't have the ice in there if you're going into the cocktail glass, but it's important to get the smoke first. And we will again garnish. You can do the strawberry on the side if you want. And I'm going to give it a quick taste. It's good. I think it could use a little more of the rosemary. So again, if you want to add more syrup at the end, you're welcome to. Another suggestion is to take your semi-charred rosemary, give it a quick stir, and you can even take a little snip and use that for a second garnish if you'd like. And there you have it. That is our inspired cocktail, smoky rosemary, a smoky scotch if you've got it available, or any other blended scotch, and then your standard gin. And you can't go wrong with lemon juice. Thanks for watching. Cheers.
All right, everyone, so I hope you enjoyed that and you have your cocktails ready now. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our esteemed speaker today. Dr. Niall W. Slater was born in Massillon and is a proud graduate of Washington High. His parents, John and Thelma Slater, were both public school teachers and strongly supported his academic interests, especially in the ancient world. After receiving a bachelor's from the College of Worcester and a PhD from Princeton, he taught at Concordia College in Minnesota and the University of Southern California before moving to Emory University in Atlanta. There he served as chairman of the classics department, teaching both Greek and Latin, then later as director of Emory Center for Language, Literature, and Culture. He received the Emory Williams Award for Distinguished Teaching at Emory in 1999 and was named the Samuel Candler Dobbs Professor of Latin and Greek in 2004. His research interests include the ancient theater and its archaeology, the ancient novel, gender studies, and recently warfare and its cultural impacts. He has published 4 books, including Plautus and Performance, The Theater of the Mind, Reading Petronius, and a recent volume just on Euripides' tragedy Alcestis. He is a past president of the Classical Association of the Middle West and South, as well as past president of the National Phi Beta Kappa Society. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Slater.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. It's a great privilege here, and I'm grateful to Alex and Stephanie for the invitation, and of course, Brandon for the help with things tonight. So I'm delighted to be with you all and making a virtual visit home again. What I'd like to share with you this evening under the theme of Circe and Greek history will involve us first and foremost in thinking about why I put the title of my talk, put history here in my talk's title in quotation marks. History is a Greek invention, or at least the word is a Greek invention. And I think people should see a little Greek in the process of discovering some of these wonderful things in the ancient world. So here is historia, as the Greeks dubbed it, transcribed historia here. But originally, historia means inquiry, including the knowledge you obtain by inquiry, by finding things out, and then the story that you write down of the results of your inquiry. This is the way the word appears in Herodotus, whom we call the father of Greek history, who did all of these things. But the word also comes over into English via Latin and then French in the process as both history and story. So Circe, we will explore both as a story and as elements of what we might recognize as history, because for the ancients, that was a spectrum. The world of myth was distant, but it was still connected to the world that they considered historical. Our central figure, Circe, was actually pronounced Kirke. Those are hard K sounds in Greek. And for those of you who have been exploring Miller's fascinating novel here, you'll all have already encountered the notion that her name means hawk. Well, maybe, sort of. In the same story that mostly introduces us to Circe, we hear about an irex kirkos, a circling hawk, and a couple of other instances of the name being used for some kind of bird. But irex is the general word for hawk. Kirkos only occurs a couple of times and is probably related to words for circling. So Circe may be a hawk, but she has some circles, some hidden things in her as well that she comes back to. We'll learn about Circe first through both two kinds of epic, from Hesiod, who wrote an epic about the birth of the gods, giving us the word Theogony. That's the fancy name, but we can translate it birth of the gods. And we'll come in a moment to the Odyssey. Here's what Hesiod has to say in the Theogony about Circe, who is the daughter of Hyperion's son Helios, in love with patient-minded Odysseus. And because this is a story about generations giving birth to future generations, she gave birth to Agrius and Latinus, excellent and strong, and she bore Telegonus because of golden Aphrodite. These, apparently all three, ruled over all the much renowned Tyrrhenians far away in the inmost parts of holy islands. Tyrrhenians we know from the Tyrrhenian Sea and eventually the Italian peninsula, and you might recognize in Latinus's name a connection to the Latins and to the Latin language from which the Romans grew. These are not elements that Miller wove into her story, only Telegonus. We meet Circe narratively in the Odyssey. And I'm going to give you just a few quotations. Much of the outline of Miller's story comes from the Odyssey, although she's layered lots of things into it by giving Circe so much of a backstory before Odysseus even shows up, and weaving in bits from much later in the myths and more scattered bits for her later story. But the Odyssey gives us the basic introduction that Odysseus and his men land on the island. He splits the party, and the first group are sent in to explore, meet Circe and her wolves that she has enchanted, and they're like pets. And so the lions and the wolves are all cringing around Circe. I'm quoting the Odyssey here from Barry Powell's very fine translation that is published by Oxford University Press. So Circe then appears, invites them in, all except for one man who doesn't trust her, doesn't go in, and all the others come down and are given a cocktail not nearly as nice as what was just compounded for us in this evening's history hour. Notice that the Greeks mixed other things in their wine to give it different flavors, cheese and barley and honey, maybe like rosemary syrup, but also dangerous potions. And a theme here already about memory and forgetting, so that the potion not only transforms their shapes, but in a sense transforms their memories by depriving them of their memories, even though their minds remain the same here at the end. They had the heads of swine, but their minds remained the same as before. This is a wonderful vase in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. This was a beloved theme in Greek art, and much of it survives on these wonderful ceramic vessels, drinking cups themselves. But here's Circe mixing her potion, and already her guests are half transformed into the swine here. Give you a close-up here. I do love this little dog here. Maybe he's a wolf, but he looks more like a dog to me, who is devoted to Circe. Perhaps I should say something about vase painting too, and we'll see a better example a little further on, but I love this scene for the outline. In this period of Greek art, which we call black figure, human bodies are mostly painted in black against an orange background, although women's bodies originally would have been overlaid with white for their skin, a skin code color that men were outside in the sun and got dark, and women tended, at least elite women, tended to stay inside and were light. In the preservation here, most of the white has disappeared, but this is Circe. Interestingly, we're also in a period where suddenly people want to write, but some of them don't know how to. These are inscriptions that use Greek letters, but actually make no words, from a painter who decided that words looked good, but wasn't actually literate yet. Well, back to the story as it's told in the Odyssey. Odysseus then comes, having gotten a report from Eurylochus, the one man who didn't come in, but also key, and you'll know this from the novel if you read that as well, having gotten some help from the god Hermes, who gives Odysseus a magic herb, a plant that will counteract Circe's magic. All he needs to do is carry it. She tries to enchant him with both the wine, with the drugs in it, but still he was not enchanted. Odysseus is telling us this story later, of course, telling it in the court of a king later on. But her magic doesn't work. Odysseus leaps up and threatens her, and she needs to plead for mercy. Here's a vase from the 440s. This one is in the Met Museum in New York, which shows this action moment. Here's the chair Odysseus was sitting on, but he's leapt up, the vase goes flying, Circe is running away here. And we're not quite sure what this half-transformed individual, is it one of Odysseus's men or a previous victim, is doing in the story. But there's a lovely moment. Well, Circe is amazed. Who is her guest? No one else has been able to withstand her potion here. And then she recognizes that it must be Odysseus. And Argeafontes of the Golden Staff is another name for Hermes, who has been telling her this story. And she decides to invite him to her hospitality and indeed to her bed, which Hermes mentioned. He can get away with that. She wants him to have dinner too and invites him to sit down. But a nice phrase, and I want you to remember this one a little bit here, nice bit of manipulation by Odysseus. How can I sit down and have dinner with you when you've turned my men into pigs? Plus, I still don't quite trust you. And she promises again, invites him to eat again, and then complains, what's wrong with my cooking? Instead, he very subtly manipulates her by saying, what sort of man, if he did his duty, would dare to partake of food or drink before he had freed his companions and beheld them with his own eyes? This became a famous phrase, and we will come back to this one. She agrees. She brings them back in, gives them a counter charm, anoints their limbs with another charm, and their bristles fall away. They were men again, but transformed by the experience, younger than before, more handsome, taller. And they recognized me. Their memories have come back, and they thank Odysseus for saving them in these circumstances. Again, as Miller's story tells it, they stay there for a year. The party goes on, but it is his companions who finally say, we can't stay here because we must think of our native land. They want to go home. Their memories are intact, even if Odysseus is tempted to stay. And so they make a plan to leave. However, before they do, Circe tells them that they must go. We don't know. Details are sketchier here in the Odyssey, but Circe reports the prophecy that they must go to the underworld, to the house of Hades, and seek the prophecy from Tiresias of how they are going to get home. Nobody wants to go to the underworld, of course, and his men are shattered, but their lamentation does no good, and off they go to the underworld. This is a moment, or this is a point at which we might think about how the stories are intersecting with or remembered in various ways in the historical world. The image that I picked for the beginning of my talk is actually an urn, an ash urn, in which the cremated remains of presumably a wealthy and noble person in Etruria, in those lands in Italy, but among the Etruscans, who did not speak a form of Latin, but a mysterious language of their own, nonetheless already know this story. This seems to be a version in which Circe has transformed various victims into animals and threatened by, perhaps this is Odysseus, or here one of his men, they are now being transformed back into humans. Though we don't have any version of a story in which they've been imprisoned in baskets, that reminds us that what comes down to us from literature is often just a selection from the stories that existed, that were shared orally through a wider world about Circe as about so many of the other heroes. And if she is somehow a goddess associated with death and leading people to the underworld, that makes her the perfect person in the Odyssey to tell Odysseus and his men that they need to go to the underworld to find out essential details of how to get home. Just a little bit more of the Odyssey here. They come back, they do succeed, and Circe is, in getting to the underworld, Circe is there to meet them, very sympathetic, reminding them, poor things who have gone down alive to the house of Hades, men who will die twice, while other men die but a single time. But she gives them a party and then sends them on their way, saying, rather deceptively, I shall show you the way and make clear each matter so that you do not suffer pain and misfortune through the wicked and terrible designs of either sea or land. Well, again, if you've read either the Odyssey or Miller, you know it doesn't quite work out that way, and Circe may well know that it's not going to. I might mention here, as we look forward, something I'll come to in a moment, her island, the island of Aiaia, where is the house of early born dawn. So at the time of the Odyssey, they're not very clear where Aiaia is compared to what later people think. The dawn should be far in the east, but also somewhere accessible from this island is the land of the underworld to which they've just sailed. And just to remind you that there are these other stories, or tantalize your imaginations with the other stories that must have been there, but we now can't quite recover. Here's a fragmentary vase that's on loan to the museum here at Emory, showing you Circe, and here you see the convention of where her skin is painted white as opposed to the male figures, is stirring her potion again. And these individuals she's transforming into donkeys. There were no donkeys in the Odyssey. And that just reminds us that there must have been other stories, stories that interested and inspired the vase painters here at the end of the 6th century BC, of other stories of what Circe could do. She must have been a very powerful figure with lots of stories around her, of whom Odysseus's story is only one. So maybe we'll talk a moment about trying to locate Circe in that ancient world. It soon became something that many people wanted to do after the Homeric poems spread and became canonized. And with some clues, we are already associating Circe with things in the West. A serious work of geography written by the scholar Strabo in the early imperial period, but it's one of the most comprehensive things, tells us about a Circaeum, a mountain, which was associated with Circe, and it's on the coast of Italy. It even has a little city on it. They have a temple to Circe, an altar to Athena. You'll recognize how she comes into the story. And Strabo says, if you go there as a tourist, the locals will show you a sort of bowl, which they say belonged to Odysseus. The area we're here's the general coast of Italy. So it's south of Rome here, from Anzio. Some of you will know that name from World War II campaigns. Cape Circeo, as the Italians pronounce it, near Terracina. And here's a view of that mountain thrusting out into the waters. It's a final peak of the Apennine range. It is attached to the land now, but already in antiquity, people thought that it had been a separate island. Theophrastus, who is a philosopher and natural scientist in the 4th century BC, in fact, he took over Aristotle's school after Aristotle died, wrote in a book about plants about this place. The district is called by Circe's name. It's a promontory, and they say Circe dwelled there. Show you the tomb of Elpenor, the guy who fell off the roof. And that once this piece of land was an island, but now the sea has been silted up and it's become united with the coast. Ancient geography and geology was not always accurate, but in this case, the modern geologists think that's right, that indeed, as you saw in that picture, what once was an element of mountain sticking out into the sea was independent and only later filled in. Cicero thinks the same thing, and there's a Roman colony in his day on that island, and Cicero knows the stories that Circe and Pasiphae and Aeetes are all brother and sisters here, daughters of Oceanus. But he testifies to the fact that there is ongoing worship of Circe on that particular island and on that coast. Strabo tells us some other things, though, that don't quite fit with that story. Here's a story about an island near Salamis, which contains the tomb of Circe. We don't really have anything else to connect to this story, but the locals there said that they had the burial place of Circe. They're little islands, and I found only one map. They're so tiny that it's hard to find a map that marks them out, but they show up in the background of the Battle of Salamis in the 5th century BC in Xerxes' invasion of Greece. Actually, I don't accept the disposition of troops here, but if anybody wants to ask about that later, we can talk about it. But here are the two little Pharmacusae islands right off the coast of Attica. Here's Piraeus, the harbor of Athens. And somewhere there in Strabo's day, they were showing something that was the tomb of Circe. So we try to locate Circe in the geography of the ancient world. The ancients were already trying to do that, but the stories are already rather scattered. And maybe just for a few final thoughts, I'd like to share with you how Circe was used in thinking about other issues, the way the anthropologists talk about things that are good to think with. Circe turned out to be good to think with in a number of contexts. The fascination with magic is always there, but it's used in different ways. Now, one of the interesting ones, which seems to be real historical event, we get from a passing mention in a collection of biographies of philosophers. Xenocrates is a minor philosopher, but he was also a statesman, and he was based in Athens. And in some wars between the Athenians and the Macedonian successors, including General Antipater, he was sent as an ambassador. So he went to Antipater. He was supposed to plead his case. First, he's invited to sit down to dinner with Antipater, and he quoted those lines that I mentioned before, that Odysseus says about his men transformed into the swine. Circe, what sort of man, if he did his duty, would dare to partake of food or drink before he had freed his companions? And Antipater, the hard-nosed Greek general, so much like that quotation that he released the Greek prisoners to Xenocrates and his mission, apparently on the basis of that, or so Diogenes Laertius tells us. On the other hand, Circe could be used to think about what enchants people and perhaps what shouldn't enchant people. So here, for example, is a Greek orator talking about, in fact, other philosophers. Why do famous people, serious people, want philosophers collecting around them, just like Circe collected her transformed animals cringing around her at the door? This is a longer passage. I won't go further with it. But Circe can be used as a way to tar people with listening to the wrong things, being transformed by the wrong things. And one final bit, one of the last stories we get about Circe from the ancient world is one invented by Plutarch. Plutarch is one of the great scholars and thinkers of the 2nd century AD. Some of you may know that he wrote the parallel lives of Greeks and Romans. Plutarch's lives match up great Romans with great Greeks, Julius Caesar with Alexander the Great, I think, and so forth. But he also wrote entertaining little essays. And in one of them, he reconstructs a dialogue where Odysseus, on his visit to Circe, notices that there are other people there who have been transformed into wild animals, not just his men. And he wants to rescue the ones who are Greeks. To do this, he asks Circe if he can do that. And she says, I may have left out a slide here, but she says, I can only do that if they want to be transformed back. So she introduces him to Gryllus, which is a Greek word for something like grunter. And she even leaves the room. I'll retire now, and I'll let him talk. He isn't transformed back into a human yet, but he's a talking pig. And Odysseus says, well, I want to rescue you. Those of you who are Greeks, I've now asked Circe to remove the spell from any Greek who chooses and restore him. And Gryllus says, no, stop, Odysseus. Not a word more. Why? Well, Gryllus proceeds to tell us why it's so much better to be an animal than a human. He says that animals by nature are braver. They conduct their battles with courage, genuine courage, unlike human beings who run away. They never sue for pity or acknowledge defeat. They never become slaves. And even if they're captured, they eventually starve themselves to death rather than endure slavery. Oh, and as a nice feminist footnote, Gryllus decides to point out that unlike human beings, in beasts, valor is naturally equal in both sexes, and the female is in no way inferior to the male. Plus, Gryllus tells us that being an animal has purged him of all those desires that human beings shouldn't have for gold, for fine robes and tapestries. And with this great conclusion, I swear there's nothing sweeter for me than to rest in when I'm full than deep, soft mud. I was suddenly thinking of that wonderful Flanders and Swan song about mud, mud, glorious mud. Gryllus certainly agreed with that. Well, those are just a few things that Circe did. Circe meant to later Greeks of the historical period. And I hope some enrichment of the experience for those of you who are reading the book of the Big Read this time, but also just for your own interest. So I thank you again for this opportunity, and I'd be delighted to answer some questions.
Thank you so much, Niall. It was such an interesting presentation. We do have some comments in the chat there saying that as well, and how they hadn't thought of Circe in the presence of folks' lives beyond the stories told in Madeline's book. So thank you. So let me get started here with some questions in both the chat and the question and answer. So firstly, one from an attendee that asked, what first got you interested in Greek mythology?
No, that's a very nice question. I came to what I do first through Latin, from Miss Murray's class at Longfellow Junior High School, and discovered that Latin was the opening into the entire ancient world. And I think that introduced me to Roman mythology, which sometimes borrows, as we saw, Cicero talks about Circe and connects those stories there, but they had their own native Roman myths of early Roman heroes, and above all, Aeneas. If I'd had an hour talk, I might have given you the version of Circe's story that comes in the Aeneid, which I also recommend. He doesn't get to meet Circe. He picks up another survivor from Odysseus's ship who tells him the story of Circe from that point of view. But yeah, it was Latin that introduced me, and then the world just expanded from there.
Awesome. We have a question here from another attendee asking if there are any mentions of Circe's loom in Greek history.
Not what we would call historical texts. And I did a quick look at, I shared a couple of favorite vases there. I don't think we have a vase scene that shows her loom from a Greek source. Whether there would be one in later Roman painting is a very good question. I could do one thing, and let's see, am I able to put things in the chat to everybody? Maybe I will do that.
Yes, you are able to do that.
Okay, wonderful. There is a wonderful work called the Lexicon. It has a very long name. And I don't know if I suspect it's enormously expensive. So I don't think our wonderful Massillon Library owns it. Kind of doubt even if Stark County does, but they might be worth checking. The Lexicon Iconographicum Mythologiae Classicae is an assembly of a huge amount of visual documentation for all of the figures. Our copy at Emory's locked away in the library during the pandemic, and I couldn't look at it. Had I even had a chance to glance at it before this, I might be able better to answer your question about whether there are any depictions of Circe at her loom. I think it's possible, but I don't think it's on vase painting. It might be later, and I'll try to find out.
Thank you. Our next question from another attendee. They ask, what brought about the downfall of Greek mythology as a belief, and when did that happen?
It happens in many ways over many times. Perhaps it's not quite right to say, well, belief is a tricky term here, because certainly when Cicero talks about Circe, he talks about her matter-of-factly as though that is part of the past. On the other hand, Cicero writes some things about religion already that suggests that other parts did not resonate with him as belief in. Maybe here is the point at which we separate belief that and belief in. And I think it's already there, well portrayed in Miller's novel, that in a sense, the question as to whether these gods, these mythic figures exist, especially the ones who are somehow very distant and clearly not walking around in the world that even exists already in the 5th century BC. Although I'd add as a footnote, say at the Battle of Plataea, some people saw a vision of a figure fighting on the side of the Greeks, and they certainly saw that as a local hero showing up. But that sort of thing doesn't happen, isn't reported much after the 5th or the 4th century BC. And the stories are there and used by people in various ways. But people didn't, even the people who had that temple to Circe probably didn't quite believe in her in the same way that we think of belief today. They may have made offerings, they may have hoped for things in return, but Circe was not the only thing in their lives that they believed in. So the larger question is when these things are replaced by more generalized beliefs in, there is a form of a belief in a god that they don't name. Plutarch tends to talk about the god, who doesn't seem to be exactly the same as Zeus, who may influence things in the universe. And then with the rise of other monotheisms and the official adoption of Christianity eventually, that's what pushes these things away from the center and to the periphery.
Fascinating. We have another question in the Q&A here. Asks, what liberties did Miller take that you found problematic, if any, interpreting Circe, and what others did you think filled out her character best from what had otherwise only been speculative?
Wonderful question. It has been a very interesting discovery process. And so I don't think we have anything about Circe's childhood. We've got parents, and we have some of those interactions, especially the interaction with Scylla. We get the most developed version of that from Ovid's Metamorphoses, but that may be a story that's, even if it's not original to Ovid, is not invented until 3rd century BC, maybe in Alexandria. So Miller is weaving these things together with a modern psychology, which is very interesting. But at first, I was thrown by the fact when the gods started sending their disobedient daughters there to Aiaia for Circe to have to deal with. I thought there were supposed to be nymphs there already. Why do we need this story here? But Miller develops it very nicely. And I think she makes the ending work remarkably well when we don't have an ending. And I'm sure she knows that bit, that there's a tomb of Circe somewhere, but that's not the ending she wants. The Telegonus makes a wonderful development of the myth. It will just leave out Latinus and any of those other inconvenient children. I've generally been very, very impressed with it, and nothing in particular has offended me. The connection with Pasiphae is important. Bringing Daedalus in is a great stroke. That comes from nowhere in connection to Circe. It comes in connection to Pasiphae. But those are the first reactions.
Excellent. Yeah, it speaks to Miller's knowledge of Greek mythology herself. She's
most
very well
impressive.
versed.
Yeah.
Yes. We do have another question from the chat that I saw earlier, asking whether it was common in Greek mythology for Titans and Olympians to fight, and what happened most commonly during those disagreements.
Yes, in the traditional stories, or most of the traditional stories, that's a stage in history. So that when the Olympian gods eventually overthrow Kronos, Zeus most importantly overthrowing Kronos, but defeating the other Titans, that's it, that's the end. In fact, it's one of the interesting and puzzling things about Greek mythology. You need a way to make it stop, because, or at least stop the generations overthrowing each other. So you have in Hesiod's Theogony, generation after generation, who come to power by overthrowing the previous generation, very Freudian, killing the father, or at least burying or doing other terrible things to the father. And it's partly solved by Zeus's victory, but also partly solved by the fact that the Olympian generation of gods does not breed new gods, or the one or two that are offspring are just incorporated into the Olympians, and they're going to be no more. There will be these heroes who may be offspring of unions between gods and mortals and so forth, but somehow the system stabilizes there. So the Prometheus story is an important one, but that's part of the one war between the gods and the Titans. And then, or it's actually, well, actually it's an aftermath of that, when it should have been, it's kind of the one final echo. But then the system is stabilized and there are somehow no more conflicts.
Thank you for that answer to what would seem to me a very complex question. So.
Many of them are in mythology, and maybe just as a footnote, of course, Rick Riordan's versions of these are unpicking that in a different way. But in the mythology system, it reaches this endpoint stability.
And I should mention our little read book selection is by Rick Riordan this year. It's the Hidden Oracle series. So
Wow.
Trials of Apollo. Yes. Another connection.
Good.
So are there any other questions for Dr. Slater? If so, you can type them in the chat or the question and answer really quick. Or you can feel free to email them to me. My email is sltoole@massillonmuseum.org, and I can direct them to Dr. Slater and get you an answer.
I will do my best. Maybe not instantly, but I will do my best.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Slater, for being with us here tonight. It was a wonderful presentation, so informative. and you really connected very well to Madeline's book, and we're so happy that everyone could join us tonight. Thank you for Joshua Kuhn's original cocktail recipe as well. So if you didn't get a chance to make Circe's Island Potion yet, please do that this weekend and let us know what you think. Check out massillonmuseum.org/Big Read for more information about upcoming Big Read programs. And again, the NEA Big Read is a program of the National Endowment for the Arts in partnership with Arts Midwest. So thank you all so very much for joining us tonight. We hope you have a great rest of your evening.